Hi, welcome to the Decorative Bead Convention at the Oregon Convention Center. We'll be having stained glass seminars later. No, all right. So where does all this data come from? You'll remember 2 years ago I talked about licenses. A year ago I talked about languages. And this year I have something new. This data comes from iterating across Google's code search crawl, as well as direct experience with our code project hosting product. How many of you use Google Code? Oh, that's great. Thank you. You know, we crawled a little over 3 billion lines of code for these studies, and Michael Spang, who is an intern this summer on my team, did most of the work, making me look like I'm erudite and studied, as well as Danny Berlin, who always helps me look better than I am. So how trustworthy and useful is this data? There's some noise in this data, I'm not going to lie to you. Lines of code is a terrible measure of anything. And probably even worse is number of commits. However, we actually have very few things beyond that. You know, for instance, one line of code can be incredibly creative, useful, powerful, and do a lot, or it can be a comment, as we all know, which are useless. And, so lines of code is sort of a weird metric. Same thing with commit. Some people commit every time they have a compile that doesn't fail. Other people commit once a day. Other people commit once a week. So grain of salt. I know what I'm doing. And so I try to keep to the kinds of numbers that are comparative across very, very large samples to sort of get rid of some of the, well, does that really matter, Chris? But anyways. Also, the way people code is really interesting nowadays. There's a lot of forking. There's a lot of syncing of projects across multiple mirrors. We try to unique these files down to their essence. So we're not copying, we're not looking at one file many, many times and counting it twice or 100 times or 15,000 times in the case of one file I found. Excuse me. So let's get started. So license use. This is really interesting. Can't you tell? So what you're looking at here is sort of the top 10 or so licenses from the 60 or so that we track. What's really happening here, you're seeing moderate increases in the GPL, LGPL, BSD, Apache, and MIT. And what's really happening there is people are leaving the sort of minority licenses that are off in the lower percentages and coming to these licenses, which is, in my opinion, a very, very good thing. Those of you who've heard me speak on license proliferation know this. So that's good, and a little boring, so let me go on. This is really interesting. Those of you who follow the GPL and its iterations, you know, what's been happening is people have been replacing GPL v2 licensing for GPL v3 licensing. Last year, we were at about 40-ish, a little more. And now we're actually more than half of all projects have transferred over to GPL v3. AGPL, from a percentage point perspective, has remained flat. However, it's added about 30,000 new AGPL files. But that's actually below the noise floor and actually kind of within the error rating of our products. So don't read too much into that. But AGPL, it's still growing, just very, very slowly. But GPL v3 is just an unvarnished success, unqualified. Language use is really interesting, and my apologies, Larry. There's been a small downtick on Perl. I know you're shocked. But you should realize we have a lot more code, so it's not really down, it's just less up, maybe. Although Fortran just stinks, and so people are using less of that. But it's actually C and C++ are also losing influence, I think, to the Go language, right? And but you see things like JavaScript, having remarkable upticks. You're seeing, C#. I think that Lua and some of the other scripting languages are actually moving to C# because you're seeing that in some really interesting environments now, especially games and the rest. So let's keep going. Corporate organizational activity. This is the first year where I actually said, okay, and by me I mean Michael Spang. I said, let's try to figure out who's doing the code contributions. And because I'm not really super comfortable with the value of commits versus the number of lines of code versus the rest, I'm not going to put them in order, okay? So these are in largely alphabetical order, although I didn't know if Sun and Oracle as a combined letter actually was before or after Z, so I just put them at the end. But amongst the top 20 were these companies and organizations. Apache and GNU, by the way, just being astonishing. So this was really, really good. You know, it's kind of a boring slide, so I'm going to keep going, but important. So, you know. But who is the most prolific developer? You might remember last year I said, is there more COBOL or Fortran, you know, as sort of a fun quiz. So this is the audience participation part of the morning to wake us all up before Mayor Adams comes up and talks about city planning. So imagine you could see every line of code ever written by Linus Torvalds or Richard Stallman. And you could see every commit they did over their histories. Who do you think has more commits into software repositories? Raise your hand if you think it's Linus Torvalds. Like I said, just go with it. How many thinks it's RMS? Well, I will say it is the latter. So, since we're in the kernel, because of Linus, Andrew Morton, sort of the patch maintainer for the Linux kernel, or Al Viro, an extremely prolific developer, who do you think has more code out there? If those of you who think it's Andrew Morton, raise your hand. They're like, who? What? And those of you who think it's Al Viro, raise your hand. Okay, so it's AKPM. So, AKPM, very important developer, but Bunk's a very interesting person. He decided a couple years ago that he thought the white space standards across the kernel were just not acceptable. Okay? So he submitted literally thousands of patches to fix this problem. Many of them subtractive, but we track them. So do you think that somebody who is obsessive, almost criminally obsessive about white space, or the main maintainer of the Linux kernel? So white space, raise your hand. Coding, raise your hand. It's actually coding, yes, okay. So your faith in humanity doesn't need to go away. So Brendan Ike or Larry Wall. So JavaScript, Perl, JavaScript, Perl, JavaScript, Perl. So Perl, raise your hand. See, I know you're in the audience, I like to tease you. JavaScript, raise your hand. It's actually Perl, yeah, So for those amongst you who are version control partisans, do you think the O'Reilly open source winner, Greg Stein, has more activity? Or future O'Reilly open source winner, Junio Mano, who's the most prolific Git committer, has more commits? Subversion, raise your hand. It's older, says Dirk. Git, raise your hand. Actually, I have to tell you, it's Junio. He's a machine. A machine. You've never seen anyone code like this guy. And my least confident number, but the most entertaining, is it Bruce Momjan of Postgres fame, or Brian Aker of MySQL and Drizzle fame? If you think it's MySQL, raise your hand. If you think it's Postgres, raise your hand. Oh, you guys, you're starting into this. So it's actually Bruce. And Brian's like, I've been robbed. I have huge commits. He has teeny ones. But you must be asking, who was number one with a bullet? Actually, I should say the first person who was number one was a script run by a Maven process that had gone out of control. Actually, I called the guy, and I was like, hey, I got to ask you, what is this hashtag after your name? And he's like, oh, it's this thing, and it just kind of went crazy, and you know, I've been meaning to call you guys and see if I can not commit that much to Google Code. And I'm like, no, it's okay, you know. I sent him a T-shirt, and yeah, it was all fine. I mean, I called him out of the blue. I'm like, hey, it's Chris from Google, what's going on? He's like, didn't you work at a game company? And I'm like, yes, it failed. Anyway, so you must be asking, who is number one? Who's the most important coder in the world? Who will be shaping computer science for decades to come? Well, it's all of you, of course. So be well, keep working, and I'll see you next year.